welcome to our Juneteenth, our second annual Juneteenth program celebration. And this is a combination. What we're going to do today, what you'll see today will show you something that we all have heard about vaguely in the background, the GI Bill. And it's always lauded as this wonderful thing. And for some people, it definitely was. Some other people, it was not so much at all. So again, I'm reminding you, we're recording. We've already started the recording. If you don't want to be recorded, just take yourself out. So let's breathe and relax and just bring our awareness inside so we can reflect on everything we see and hear today. Bring our awareness inside. Let's take a deep breath in, everybody together. And then open your mouth, audibly exhale. Release all the tension and stress from inside the body. And take another inhale and exhale. And just feel inside your chest. Let your heart come to the fore. Let your heart be open today. So see what you see and feel what you feel with your heart. Let the thoughts come into one ear and go out the other. Don't follow your thoughts today. Just open your heart. And okay, we're back. Hi, Daniel. I see everybody. Hi, Gabe. So it's good to see so many of you today. This is great. So we've got a whole program for you today, and we're going to start with a recording that was put together by Farrell Saunders to look at what it really meant to be free on this Juneteenth and how much struggle that has taken for everybody. You hear my voice, it's getting up, the energy's coming up because there's a lot of struggle involved, and we're going to show this today on the presentation. So we're going to start with that. So Adam, can you start that for us?
Welcome to the second annual Juneteenth celebration hosted by the Racial Justice Collaborative. We are going to be discussing some key moments in history relating to the story of the African American people and our history in the United States of America. We're going to be discussing these key moments that begin in the late 1910s and move onwards into the 1920s. The Red Summer of 1919 is an important event in history where right after the end of the First World War, you have Black servicemen that fought in the European theater returning to the homes that they had left in the United States of America and the social positions that they had also left in the United States of America, and having tasted degrees of equal treatment on the theater of war over there. Once they returned here, there was a great degree of contention and incident that was caused throughout a large number of cities in the United States. For historical context, the First World War, the war to end all wars, is named because it was a massive war, the most massive war in its time yet as of that day. It was a war between the Entente powers, the United Kingdom, France, the Third Republic of France, and the Empire of Russia against the Central Powers, the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman empires. Later, other powers such as Japan, and of course, because of the history we're going to be talking about today, the United States were drawn into the conflict on the side of the Entente powers. Black servicemen obviously went alongside white servicemen on the behalf of the United States heading to the European theater. In the First World War, there were originally 20,000 African American volunteers out of the 100,000 American volunteers in general. This was not enough soldiers, and so this was the situation in which the congressional bill creating the first formal and remaining draft that continues to this day rather than being for a specific conflict. This was the first time this was brought in, and after that was ushered in, there were over 700,000 Black soldiers serving in the armed forces. Black enlisted men were barred from serving in the Marines, were only allowed to do menial tasks in the Navy, but were allowed to fill every role in the Army, including combat roles, except for aviation units. The Air Force did not yet exist at this time, and this even did include officer positions for the segregated Army, since Black soldiers and white soldiers could not serve in the same units due to the laws of segregation in the United States, and therefore this even required Black officers. And so some 600 Black officers were trained and given the ranks of lieutenant or captain, and were allowed to oversee these units. The Red Summer of 1919 was named this because when these African American soldiers returned from the European theater and came back to the homes that they had left behind, the white society that they had left behind in America, with their very specific roles that had been cut out for them before, were concerned that once they returned, they would be uppity, they would be egotistical or prideful, however they would think to call it, and therefore unwilling to return to the servile and secondhand conditions that they had left from, many of which simply slavery adjacent. And therefore, there was a great deal of pent-up aggression on the part of whites in these cities where a large number of Black veterans were returning to. In addition to this, there was also this degree of camaraderie and respect that these Black veterans had received serving overseas in the European theater, and thus there was a degree of contention on the behalf of these Black veterans, which now had tastes of this respect, and even less so than they were due, but more so than they received before. And there was a great deal of strife over how this would be treated when these two forces returned and collided in the summer of 1919, which would erupt out into violent altercations and bloody attacks all throughout the country, and would go on for years after. There are a great number of violent and lethally destructive riots throughout the United States in cities all across the country, starting in the summer of 1919. But they generally fall into two sort of scales of outcome. There were incidents that simply resulted in massacre. This was often a result of unprepared nature or a lack of weapons on the behalf of the African American communities in those circumstances, and also circumstances of violent and courageous resistance on the behalf of other African American communities that were targeted in the exact same way as others. However, with weapons and with training, much of which coming from these very same African American veterans returning from the First World War, they were able to fight back and defend the homes of those who were so violently under attack. Perhaps one of the most famous by name, and due perhaps partially because of the centennial anniversary of the event, is the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, in which hundreds of African Americans were killed and thousands were left homeless, as entire swaths of the African American neighborhood of Tulsa were left completely destroyed in the wake of white riots and destructive forces moving through and razing neighborhoods down to the ground, brick by brick, board by board. There are many massacres like this throughout the United States, such as the massacre of Rosewood, Florida, where this predominantly African American town was destroyed, much in the same way as Tulsa, and its citizens were driven out into the swamps, where they were hunted like animals by these rioting and destructive mobs and Klansmen, all such thing. Right alongside police forces, the citizen vigilante rioter alongside the official law enforcement officer, doing the same job and with the same goal and intention in their heart. And the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, which was incited by Black sharecroppers deciding to unionize in order to escape the slavery adjacent conditions of that entire system, which was resulted in the slaughter and destruction of all the farmers and their families that dared to scheme to make money. We also have the specific stories of resistance in this particular event. The Chicago race riot of 1919 started when, at a segregated beach in Lake Michigan, a Black beachgoer drifted too close to the white section. His presence, of course, deemed insulting, worthy of violence. This teenager on a pool toy just drifting in the lake was struck by rocks by the white beachgoers, knocked unconscious, and killed as he fell into the lake and drowned. There were eyewitnesses to the violent attack, and of course, the police, which eventually arrived, arrested none of the white citizens in question. And this immediately broke out into violent altercation, with Black beachgoers with weapons breaking out and coming into violent conflict with white beachgoers. And this violent conflict would spread throughout all of Chicago as it left this initial incident at the beach. And this would result in massive roving mobs of white citizens coming together in order to stamp out and burn out this Black menace and clean it up, as they would often say. In this regard, the Black population of Chicago, however, was unwilling to be moved aside. And with weapons and with training from the Black World War I veterans that returned to cities much like Chicago, they were able to fight back and fight back hard, driving many of these mobs from Black neighborhoods. And of course, there were many Black lives taken, but in this violent conflict, this example of a miniature war, it was not one-sided. Washington, D.C., an incredibly similar story, where initially it began with a Black woman who was assailed by who she described to be a Black robber, which received no media attention, of course. And then later that month, a white woman robbed also by a Black man, which prompted a 100 police officer response, as well as a 1,000 volunteer militia response of white citizens pouring out into the Washington, D.C. area. In addition to it being in response to these robberies and the hunting of this Negro fiend that had perpetrated them, according to the newspapers, the exact phrasing being just that, there was also doing to this being in the age of prohibition, a number of underground, you know, uh, like bootleggers networks that were primarily managed and controlled by black families in the Washington, D.C. area. And so many of these white mobs, in addition to hunting for the Negro fiend robber, also just brazenly broke into black homes in order to steal possessions, including the much coveted liquor that was traded in Washington, D.C. However, the black veterans, which brought military training, expertise, and weapons handling, were able to help other members of the black community fight back. And the bootlegger community, which had experience with smuggling of illicit materials, were able to bring weapons into Washington, D.C. in order to arm the black population when the government shut down the sale of firearms in the Washington, D.C. area once it was found that they were primarily being bought by black citizens. Because apparently, even back then, it could be done that fast when guns were in the hands of the black population. But fortunately, due to the resources and the ingenuity of the community, they were able to still get the tools necessary to fight back against this brazen and violent oppression. And it was not only limited to this 1,000-man mob or 1,000-man posse, whichever you would want to describe it. It was also corrupt police officers, which would brazenly break into black homes without warrants and were defended with lethal force, with many of these officers being killed when they simply broke into black homes, as well as even military forces, which were called in to defend Washington, D.C., with cavalry and Marines even being taken on by armed black citizens defending their neighborhoods. And the result of these violent altercations that ravaged the entirety of the country, but in these most fascinating of cases, they were not one-sided, far from it. And in this particular case, in the Washington, D.C. race riot, there was actually a higher total of white fatalities and injuries even than black, showing a tremendous camaraderie and tremendous courage in the face of overwhelming odds and fighting back against those that would destroy homes and businesses on a mere whim. We stand here at the centennial commemorating event of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre in 1921. Like so many of these towns, like all of these towns that we had described, it was a thriving black-owned business that was brought up from scratch by those who had even less than scratch to build it. And it was a great achievement by those who were simply attempting to build a life and prosperity for themselves, something every citizen should be able to have and should be able to have without needing to fight for it, needing to be able to fight for every inch of it. And like so many other circumstances like that, it was taken so violently from the people that lived there and had built it. It's important to remember.
Farrell Saunders, giving us an overview for what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to start this part of the program with the presentations that I'm giving, and Lane and Jordana. So we're going to start with Jordana. And Jordana is a lawyer. So she is going to do the legal, explain all the legal aspects and the policy aspects where Black people have been intentionally disinvested in, and white people have been intentionally, way overwhelmingly benefited. So Jordana.
Let's leave the slide here for now. So thank you and welcome everyone. Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Farrell, for your presentation. I'm kind of moving things along from where Farrell left off with physical brutality and force to the brutality and unfairness of law and policy. One of the things I want to do, though, is just put context around Diane Wong and Lane Aryeh's presentation. So you're going to have what I think is a unique experience, because often at these events, we focus on history and law and policy, and we don't hear from actual people who've had to think about and struggle through what they've been through. This is, to me, especially important for white people, because often when we do these kind of cold, hard presentations on wealth, on history, on public policy and law, whites can often kind of step back and look at that as saying, oh, that's a Black experience, I'm not involved. But this is very much a white experience, because as you'll see, as Blacks were denied and suffered, whites soared. And so it's not just looking at what happened to Black people, it's also looking at the billions of dollars that engorged white communities through these laws and policies. Now, I am going to talk about what Diane said, but I also want to make clear that there's a very emotional component to all of this. And I've known Diane most of my adult life. I've known that she has made it her business to try and understand the forces that hollowed out her African-American multi-ethnic family, their financial opportunities, academic ones. I've also known Lane for several years, and he's one of the very few white people, at least that I know, who's aware of and willing to acknowledge and talk about the policies in white supremacy and anti-Blackness that actually really helped his family, like millions of white families in the US over the past decades, to build wealth through government policies, again, as Diane said, purposefully kind of putting the wind to the back of white families and putting a headwind, a block to the goals and aspirations of Black families. He doesn't block that conversation with comments like, well, my family worked hard, my family struggled. He understands through his study, and you'll hear him speak about it, that, you know, no one's saying white people haven't had to struggle, but what he would probably agree with, and what we might all agree with, is that whites have not had the weight of anti-Blackness built into every facet of American society to add to their existing burdens, the existing burdens that we all have. I want to point out that the Racial Justice Collaborative, and those of you who've been at these events know it, but there might be some people here who haven't, we focus almost exclusively on anti-Blackness and specifically anti-African American policy and patterns and practices. And the reason is that when you look at the statistics, and we're just going to go through a few that are quite devastating, the wealth gap and any other measure, you cannot but have to focus on what has happened to African Americans, and on the other side, what happened to white people as that pain was being inflicted. So our operating principle, I think it's safe to say, is that healing that divide is going to allow all the other divides, immigrants of color, African immigrants, misogyny, all of that, all of this will help, because anti-Blackness flows through all of those other communities. Now, a final point, and then we'll get to this, my brief presentation, is in 2014, there was a study that showed that 75% of whites had not one Black friend. When I say the word friend, I'm not talking about work colleagues or casually, you know, people you meet casually at the gym or walking your dog. I'm talking about the type of friend that you call when you need help, the type of friend that you know inside out, the type of friend that comes to your house for dinner, that knows your family, knows your children, between Black and white specifically. Now, we tend to care about people we know. I don't know if everyone would agree with that. I sometimes find that unfortunate, but that's a whole other presentation. But we tend to care about people we know, and we tend to want to know more about them and help them. If you think about that statistic, it really undermines that whole idea of empathy, and it really supports the idea of the two Americas. And in speaking about white people in general, the fact that if they don't know Black people and don't care about Black people, then they're not invested in really changing the system. That could be one way to look at it. And I think when you listen to Diane Wong and Lane Aryeh, I think you're going to have a chance to understand in a very, very deeply personal and painful way how all of this intricate system of policies and laws really hurts individuals right down to the core. So we're going to look at a few items. I've just picked them out, just snapshots, because there's so much to know. But The ones that I've picked out, I believe, are some of have had the most devastating effect on Black people and the most powerful effect on flowing white people, regular white people, upward into things they could not even have dreamed of in terms of home ownership and wealth building. So anyway, Adam, if you could take us to the, well, leave it here for, sorry, Adam, leave it there for 1 second. I just want to point something out. When I call this by design and intertwined, what I'm referring to is by design means we can't think that all of these, the GI Bill and everything, were simply kind of put out there with no intent to help or hurt, that they're neutral, that they're race neutral. They're not. They are by design. And I believe Diane used the word purposeful in their intent, both to push white people forward and hold Black people, Black families back. And intertwined goes back even to what Farrell is talking about. And if you've been to other presentations of Farrell, he goes way back into history. Everything is intertwined and leads to exactly where we are today. It couldn't have led to anything else given the policies. So the next slide, Adam, please. What I want to look at, and again, it's 10, 15 minutes, and it's going to frame the discussion of Diane and Lane, and that's the only reason I'm doing this. A lot of you may have heard these things, but a lot of terms are thrown around: GI Bill, redlining, the wealth gap, and I just want to hone in a little bit on them because they apply directly to Diane and Lane and their families. So in this case, the civil rights lawyer, Derek Bell, I'd like you to pay attention to the sources as well. These are things you can decide to read if you haven't. His very famous treatise called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I think this encapsulates everything we're going to talk about, is that when whites perceive that it will be profitable or cost-free to serve, hire, admit, and otherwise deal with Black people on a discriminatory basis, on a non-discriminatory basis, they will do so. So we know that hasn't happened very often. When they fear, accurately or not, that there may be a loss or an inconvenience or upset to them, and even if not to them, to other whites, then discriminatory conduct follows. And I think that really encapsulates what we're looking at today. The next slide, please. So I just want people to know that, I'm an attorney, but I'm not a civil rights attorney. And we're not economists, attorneys, sociologists. A lot of what we're looking at is dry and cold, and maybe to many people too complex and therefore boring. The problem with that is really, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the real hurt and pain is. Obviously, what Farrell described is in another realm, but this is what undermines and hurts people and pushes other people forward. So it's important, even when you leave this, to try and take the time to look into these a little. And when you do, you're going to understand how the interplay of all of these, how they mix, and how they've just covered all these different eras and go through generations to the very people who are here today, including Diane and Lane. Next, please. So what is the racial wealth gap? So we really, again, each of the things I'm bringing up can be looked at for weeks and months and written about, and they have been, and I don't pretend to bring anything new. I'm just trying to give you a snapshot. So the racial wealth gap, it means the disparity in median wealth between racialized groups. And in this case, the most pronounced, and everything I'm talking about is measurable, is between white households and Black and Latinx households. So here's some examples that are quite shocking. Between 1983 and 2013, white households saw their wealth increase by 14%. And at the same time, Black households saw a decline in their wealth of 75%, while Latinx saw 50%. The Economic Policy Institute reported 25%, this is in 2020, that Black households, 25% of them have zero or negative net worth, while only 10% of white families are at that level of poverty. Next, please. So here again, this is an important thing. You're going to hear Diane and Lane talk about wealth and income, and I believe Lane has an interesting kind of way of framing this, the difference, but I'm going to look at wealth. It's the difference between a household's assets and debt or liabilities. Each of us has a household. You could be a renter, an owner, and you can know this for yourself, and if you don't, maybe you should check it out. In the second quarter of 2020, white households, who are 80% of or 60% of households, held 84% of the wealth. And look at the figure there, right? Comparatively, Black households, they account for 13.4%, had 4% or 4.6 trillion of total household wealth. Remember that when we talk about wealth, it's a safety net, and Lane will look and talk about this as well, but it's also what you transfer to your family. And essentially, it's lightly taxed compared to income. So on top of it, when you have wealth, you're able to really protect that set of funds. 30% of white households received inheritance in 2019 at an average level of $195,500, compared to 10% of households at an average of 100,000. And again, everything I'm bringing to you, anything that sparks your curiosity, you can find everything at primary sources and very good research at the Brookings Institute and others. Next slide, please. This goes back to inheritance as well. Now, the economists Derek Hamilton and William Darity. William Darity has written an amazing book on reparations. He's considered that he's an economist and the father of the reparations, African-American reparations movement. They found that inheritance and other transfer intergenerationally account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic or socioeconomic indicator. And I think that frames well the importance of being able to inherit. Now, all of us know in the US, I consider the US an extreme version of capitalism, the most extreme that exists globally. Real estate and other things, real estate is a real way to build wealth. And so I want you to think about that as we go through this presentation. The next slide, please. Okay, you're saying to yourself, oh God, 1862, my God, we're really going back in time. Why are we doing this? I'm gonna pick out 3 or 4, maybe there's 5 particular acts and just quickly show you for each one how they continue to impact us. So very briefly, you look at this, citizens of the US were able to buy for a filing fee 160 acres of expropriated land from tribes west of the Mississippi. This is in 1862, and it was available to any citizen or person eligible for citizenship. When you read the act, which I've read, it's very race neutral. You just sort of see this language about citizenship. I've reminded people here that the 1790 Naturalization Act only recognized potential citizens who were white immigrants at the time. It started as being white men, and then it expanded to other white people. So within that act, it's already excluded people who were not deemed white at the time. And that's an important point. If you just read it, you wouldn't know. And in fact, when you research this online, there's many race neutral presentations of the Homestead Act where if you didn't go further, you'd have no idea of who it benefited and who it didn't. Look at this now. 4,000 to 5,500 Black families were able to become part of 1.6 million landowners who gained deeds through the act. And then today, there are 46 million known individuals who are property descendants of the beneficiaries of the act. This is a through line from 1862 to literally today. Those 46 million have been able to build on what those white citizens and white immigrants who became citizens were able to get through this like massive transfer of land at the time in the United States. So next slide, please. Again, just very quickly, another race neutral act, the Social Security Act. It excluded farm workers and domestic workers for whatever reasons from accruing benefits. At the time, as most of us know, most Black people were still living in the US, or they were starting the migration up north, where they worked as farm workers and domestic employees. As Farrow used the term slavery adjacent, that's what we're looking at. So 2/3 of Black people at the time never received those benefits, wealth building opportunities. Keep in mind, yes, it may have changed later, but it's at that point where people were not able to start building wealth. So already they're being left behind. And whites were jumping ahead, getting benefits. Every time you see what's hurting Black people, remember the wind is at the back of white people in all of these acts and laws. Next, please. Here's another example, the FHA, Federal Housing Administration. Here's just a few facts of the things that it did: building housing, housing for returning veterans, housing for people with, sorry about the word handicapped, but anyway, low-income Americans. It generally sparked production of housing. Next slide. But here's the rub with this. It created programs to subsidize low-cost loans. And again, this interplays with the GI Bill, as we'll see, and as you'll hear from Lane and Diane. It opened up home ownership to millions of people who could never have bought a home, never, had this not happened. So look at the figures: 120 billion in new housing, subsidized by the government between 34 and 1962. Less than 2% went to Black families. It essentially locked them out of home ownership the way that all of these other very average, typical white Americans were able to build wealth, start transferring wealth later on to their children could build wealth, etc. Next slide. The GI Bill, we hear that term used a lot. It's really called this, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Just so you know, we're not going to go much further than that. But this bill was signed into law in 44, and it ushered in a sweeping set of benefits for veterans. As many of you know, college tuition, low-cost loans, many, many things that allowed these returning vets to just really take off, and their families could take off financially. The language of the bill, again, if you read it, it doesn't have, it's race neutral. However, because of push in Congress of certain senators, particularly from the South, they insisted that the states should run the programs, meaning implement them. That led to the shutting out of 1.2 million Black veterans, World War II veterans, who had served the country. And as Farrell was looking at World War I, those were still racially segregated units. So you imagine you're going to Europe to fight against fascism and Nazism, and then you come back to this. It guaranteed low interest mortgages. Again, people, dry stuff. This is the stuff of what families are made of, is what they can afford, what they can do, what they can grow. So by the VA and the federal government deciding not to handle things, they were allowing these white-run financial institutions free rein to refuse mortgages to Black applicants and probably other Black applicants, other POC applicants, but for our purposes, we're focusing on African Americans. Next slide, please. Here's the effect of the GI Bill, that the racial bias effects, they're still with us. So here's just two examples. In 47, out of 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities, only 2 went to Black borrowers. I can't tell you how they got theirs, but those are the statistics. And the book by Ira Katz-Nelson has written a lot. He's an economic historian, and he's worth looking at. This was not just the South, and we go to New York and New Jersey. So this is the area where Lane is going to talk about. There you'll see only 100, fewer than 100 of these types of very affordable mortgage loans. 67,000 of them, only less than 100 went to through the GI Bill to support Black people and Black families. And then when you look at it, 8 million vets received education training. That, of course, helps build wealth. And 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion. Katz-Nelson has said that the GI Bill, going back to Diane's comment that we all have been taught that the GI Bill was this elaborate and fabulous thing, and it was for many white people, but there was no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill, according to Ira Katz-Nelson. Next slide, please. I want to now touch on redlining. You've heard that term as well bandied about a lot. So I just want to really quickly hone in on what it was. It's a practice of arbitrarily denying or limiting financial services and other related services, appraisals and so forth, in specific neighborhoods, particularly if the residents were Black, POC, or poor. And I say were because we're going to look at it from the timeline, but I'm going to argue that this is still going on in many different ways. The HOLC, you may have heard about them, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was a government-backed Corporation, it instituted these maps that were color coded. They called them residential security maps of, and I got a number recently. Let me just find this quickly. I believe it was cities with 40,000 or more residents. So many, many American cities. They used racial criteria to categorize lending, insurance, and many services related to owning homes. So banks and insurers adopted HOLC maps. The FHA adopted their methods to make decisions about where to build federally insured housing. Next frame, please. We get into the color codes. And by the way, I'd like you to pay particular attention to this source. The University of Richmond, and I think other universities have actually made interactive maps. I believe the University of Richmond has 200 maps where you can go in and find your city and you overlay it. You can even see where you lived and see how it was zoned or coded, I should say. So the colors were green, best, A, blue, still desirable, yellow is declining, and red is hazardous, or D. So here's some examples that you can find yourself, but I just pulled these out. They're called clarifying remarks. So in Camden, for example, there was a D-graded neighborhood abutting an A-graded neighborhood, which apparently was unusual. The quote in the clarifying remark is, "It is 100% poor class Negroes, practically all on relief. A high wall, however, prevents their spread as if it's vermin or germs." In another neighborhood that they described as occupied by Polish professionals mostly, it was graded declining, so in the yellow zone. And if you look at the map, it would be yellow. It was one step above red line. The quote there, the clarifying comment, is Negro district on edge of section, but splendid cooperation of all residents in this section will always prevent spread. So that word spread keeps cropping up. And if you go look at these maps and read the clarifying remarks, you'll see it. An interesting point here that goes to the heart of individuals versus policy and government. Here they're confirming that the Polish professionals in this neighborhood were very much cooperating with the HOLC and other entities to not allow Black people, to keep Black people out, to build this kind of legal wall to stop their neighborhood from declining. Next slide, please. Again, the impact of redlining, and a lot of this is with us today, and you'll see a lot of information at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Very clearly written. All the sources I've chosen are just for all of us to understand them, not just accountants and economists and sociologists. So you look at redlining, what does it lead to? Disinvestment or divestment, housing decline, predatory lending, which is contract leasing. I think Lane is going to talk about that, or Diane will as well. That affected both of their families. Property value loss. What else happens? Foreclosures, vacancies, loss of assets, issues socially, you know, big health problems, asthma, lead, diabetes. Diane is going to talk about her community and the environmental devastation that affected her family and the people living around her. Next slide, please. So the effects are with us today. When you think of, most American cities are highly racially segregated still. I think we can, well, I'm not saying we can agree on it, but I think we can say that that is the case. 74% of the areas that HOLC had graded in the past as hazardous remain low to moderate income today. And 64% of those HOLC graded hazardous redlined areas are largely Black neighborhoods today. And so again, you see that just when you think about, oh, that happened in the past, it is with us today. It's the legacy that's very much alive today. Next slide. I want to end on this quote by Malcolm X in '64, which I think addresses everything that's worth noting, but applies to what we're going to talk about and applies to what Diane and Lane are going to say. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, it's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made. They, he's referring to white society, white institutions haven't even begun to pull the knife out. They won't even admit the knife is there. This is in 1964. I'm a person who's, the people here who know me, I'm pretty much a glass half full, a glass half empty person. And I believe that this comment or position of Malcolm X holds very true today. And I want you to keep that in mind as you listen to the stories and think about this through line from the 1860s and before, really, from 1619 all the way to today. It's all intertwined and it's all by design. So I'll hand it back to Diane, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Jordana. Very clear presentation, and especially of these policies. And Jordana presents the policies. So keep those in mind, because as Lane talks and as I talk, I'm going to maybe mention them, but I'm going to gloss over them because the details Jordana has already explained. And the reason that we're going to just move into our own stories is that, as I said in the beginning, keep your hearts open, let your thoughts keep moving. Feel into it, just get a sense of what we're talking about and see it overlaid over whole communities of people. And then you'll have an opportunity in the small groups. We're also demonstrating how we talk about ourselves. When you get into your small groups, we're going to have specific questions that are going to take you through some of the kind of information that we're looking at for ourselves. So we're demonstrating the same thing we're going to ask you to do in the small groups. That is the racial justice collaborative way. We don't just tell you what to do, we show you, because we're people too. We have all the same flaws. We all have anti-Blackness. It's a part of white supremacy. It's everywhere. And so all of us have that, and we have to at least begin to see it. So thank you, Jordana. And Lane, I can't say enough about Lane. Lane is a psychologist, a doctor of process-oriented psychology. He teaches, he is in private practice. He's a lot of things. And today he's going to talk about the GI Bill and a lot about whiteness. And I'm just forecasting that Jordana is going to do a presentation in August on wealth, how it got built and who has it. And you can see by her presentation today, you're going to want to be there. So we'll keep you informed. And Lane in September will do a workshop on whiteness and how white people can develop the resilience so that we can get to the healing of the racial divide. How can white people learn to stay there, sit there, and participate with Black people in discussions of reparations? That's where we're all heading. So, Lane.
Hey, everybody. Wow. Wow. Pharaoh, Jordana, powerful, powerful. Hard to listen to and really important to listen to. So yeah, I'm gonna go in a very different direction. Diane and I are gonna tell very personal stories of how these laws and policies impacted our families. And you know, my story may be very different than yours because, you know, there's a lot of different white experiences in the United States, and I know, you know, some folks are here from Europe and a lot of different white experiences. If you find yourself discounting what I'm saying because our backgrounds are different, I just want to invite the white folks here just to take a breath and just remember that our lives were all influenced by the same racist policies, which over time led to this huge wealth gap. It's actually the median wealth of white families in this country is 10 times greater than the median wealth of Black families in this country. So All right, I'm going to share my screen here. So my dad was born, whoops, I got to the wrong one, was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1925 in an immigrant Jewish neighborhood where everybody spoke Yiddish. Now, at the time, Jews were not considered white in this country and were not welcomed by many Americans. And there were a lot of other immigrant groups in this country who were also not welcome, who were also not considered white, like Italians and Irish and Spanish and Mexicans, Chinese, Native Americans, and Blacks, right? And all of us were not considered white at the time. And I grew up hearing that my dad was the son of poor immigrants. And he started with nothing, and he worked hard, and he was smart, and so he succeeded. But that wasn't the whole story, right? As we just heard from Jordana, right? As a veteran of World War II, the GI Bill paid for his law school. And by then, by some legal and social magic, Jews were then considered white. And my dad benefited from systemic and structural advantages of whiteness. And he got a job as a lawyer, and he got married, and he moved to a white middle-class part of the Bronx where I was born in 1958. And 10 years later, in 1968, using a federal housing authority loan, he bought a house on a tree-lined street in the suburbs of Westchester County, north of New York City. And because of redlining, as Jordana said, only white people could buy homes in those suburbs. As a matter of fact, Jackie Robinson, an amazing baseball player and civil rights activist who became the first Black person to play Major League Baseball, even though he was a huge star, he was popular, he was rich, he was famous, but in the 1950s, he was not able to buy a home in Westchester County, where I lived. When he and his wife offered the asking price for a house was pulled off the market. So I just want to pause for a moment and just say, there's a lot of different kinds of suburbs. There's a lot of different kinds of suburbs, right? There's like really fancy suburbs with expensive homes. And then there's suburbs that are filled with tract homes, right? These are obviously very different kinds of living experiences, and they come with very different price tags. But all of these very different kinds of suburbs were socially engineered specifically for white people to live in. And these very different kinds of homes were only available because of what Jordana was just saying about FHA loans and redlining. They were only available for white people to buy. Now, who was white at this point? At this point, a lot of these groups were already white. My town was about 85% Italian, 10% Jewish, and 5% Irish. None of these groups had been considered white before, but now, legally and socially, we were all white. I lived in this town, Harrison. We had all become white in the eyes of the law and policy, so we were welcome. It was a very economically diverse town. There were shopkeepers and professionals, manual laborers, all living in very different kinds of homes in this town. But the large majority of the residents of Harrison owned their homes, and all were white. So now let's talk about some of the social and especially economic impact of this racial injustice. but let's start with the social. So there's my high school select chorus that I'm the guy in the back trying in the middle trying to crack up my friend. And one result of this social engineering segregation based on race was that I grew up with white people all around me. All my teachers were white. All the books I read were written by white people. The history books were all about white people. Well, we did actually read about the civil rights movement in 11th grade, but we learned that those were bad white people who did bad things long in the past. It was about 10 years earlier that the civil rights stuff was going on. But the things were better now. And nobody ever mentioned that the racial inequity and oppression were still happening, or that they were present in the very fact that there were no Black or Indigenous or people of color in our classes. Now, I rarely saw the police. And when I did, they were actually friendly, not like in this idealized photo, right? But my friends and I were never stopped. We were never frisked. We were never beaten. We were never arrested. We were never shot, right? It doesn't mean actually that we weren't doing illegal things. And I hope my kids aren't going to watch this, but once my friend was teaching me to drive with a stick shift, and I was in his car, stopped at a light going up a hill, smoking a joint. And a police car pulled up right behind us. And I was, oh my God, here we are smoking a joint. My friend puts out the joint and he gets out of the car, cool as anything, goes and says, "Excuse me, officer, could you please back up your car? I'm teaching my friend how to drive a stick shift and he's not so sure he's going to be able to do this on a hill. We don't want him to hit you as you know, if he can't get started." The police officer smiled and backed up. Now, we can all imagine the tragic consequences if my friend and I had been Black, or if white suburban neighborhoods were policed like Black neighborhoods. But we just drove away. We didn't go to prison. We weren't branded as felons for the rest of our lives. We didn't have our education and our careers cut short, or much, much worse. Now, in 1968, that same year that we moved to Westchester County, the Fair Housing Act became the law of the land, and which prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing. And the federal government has still, to this day, not made Westchester County remove the barriers to Blacks and Latinx families moving in. In the last years of my father's life, actually, there was a plan to build affordable housing at a nearby golf course. And my father was one of his many white neighbors who were against that affordable housing. And I tried to convince him to support the proposal, but he wouldn't change his mind. And again, he never mentioned race as the reason, right? Is this race neutral thing. He never mentioned that it had anything to do with race. He said he didn't want his property value to go down. And his intent may not have been racist, but the impact was. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at property values. So to prepare for this race retreat today, I called the Westchester County clerk and I found the amount that my parents paid for their first home in 1968 and the amount that they sold it for in 1984. In those 16 years, the house had increased in value almost 8-fold. They took that money when they sold their house in 1984, and they bought another house in a nearby town. And they lived there in that town until they both died. And when they both died, my brothers and I inherited that house, right? That's what Jordana was talking about, right? We inherited that house. And when we sold that house in 2016, its value had increased threefold, right? So the first investment had increased eightfold, and then that increased 3 times as much. That original investment had increased by 24 times, right? And part of that increase was surely the location and the timing of the sale, right? But according to the Census Bureau, this is the Census Bureau, right? This government agency, the median price for a new house in 1968 was around $25,000. That's 1968. And the median price for a new house in 2018 was $320,000. That's 12.8 times the original value, right? So remember, this was originally one pile of bills. Now we've got 12.8 piles of bills there, right? This goes a long way to explain why the median wealth of white households in the US is 10 times greater than the median wealth of Black households, right? And just to say, a good job doesn't close the wealth gap. You know, you could say, well, people have good jobs, you know. According to a study by the Center for American Progress, Blacks with at least a college degree still have about 30% less wealth than whites without a college degree. So why does wealth matter? Why are we talking about wealth instead of income? This quote from Harvard sociologist Alexandra Kilowald really explains it well. She says, you can think of income as water flowing into your bathtub, whereas wealth is like the water that's sitting in the bathtub. If you have wealth, it can protect you if you lose your job or your house. Wealth is distinctive because it can be used as a cushion and it can be directly passed down across the generations. So I just want to say that's what happened to my family, you know, and the story that I heard from my father was true. You know, he did start with nothing. He was smart and he did work hard, but it's an incomplete story. Nobody ever told me that he had a current at his back, unfair advantages that were specifically designed to benefit white people and to disadvantage Black people and other people of color. Now, the message I internalize from that incomplete story, which is a lesson that many white people internalize, is that we deserve what we have. And the corollary message, the message that goes along with that, that's unspoken, is that if Black and brown people don't have what we have, they must not be as smart or work as hard. But if many Black and brown families work 2 or 3 jobs to stay afloat, do I really work harder than them? I don't think so. And if Blacks without a college degree have 30% less wealth than, if Blacks with a college degree have 30% less wealth than Blacks without a college degree, do I really deserve more, what I have more than they do? And if their income is running through the faucet and down the drain, and I have some water in my bathtub, the system is working as it was designed to work. because of the GI Bill and FHA loans and socially engineered segregation and the increased value of my parents' home, I have a cushion. And it's not fair. And I feel sick to my stomach thinking about how many Black families were cheated out of this windfall. So thanks for listening to my very particular story that is also not particular. And now we have a chance to listen to a very different story about how Diane's family was impacted by these same racist policies.
Thank you, Lane. I love it to have this opportunity to hear from Farrell and then to hear from Jordana. We're all having this opportunity, and to Lane, we're all making it clearer how we have come to this place. That's what began our journey of thinking. We're looking at COVID-19, and people started to ask on television news, why are the Black people and the brown people, why are they contracting COVID in way higher numbers? And look at there, why are the Black people and the brown people the ones scurrying around delivering your food to you while you are comfortably sitting trying to escape from the virus? Why are they the essential workers out on the street? And so when Jordana talked about the 1935 Social Security Act, and you remember we put outside of that act the domestic workers and the farm workers. And so those things have continued, even though there were some slight changes, those kind of trajectories have continued so that the people doing the kind of work well, first of all, they have to, because, you know, we need shelter and we have to eat. So that's why they're doing the work. So now I'm going to talk about a different story. And before I start my story, I've got people here who know me very well, and they know the story. But before I start the story too much, I want to do a disclaimer. This is my disclaimer. I very infrequently do this. I very infrequently touch on, really, there's no other way to look at it, as my trauma growing up, the trauma in my family, my mother's trauma, my father's, the trauma of the Black experience. It is such a traumatic experience. So if you're Black and you're young and you don't remember, or you didn't see, remember that, as Sundiata points out all the time, we didn't get here on our own. We come here through direct lines of ancestors. So see your ancestors in this. And if you're white, and listen to what Lane talked about, see the trajectory of your people, and then juxtapose that, which is what we're going to do now, with the Black experience, a very specific experience in the United States. So I'm going to take a deep breath here. So I'm telling you, I don't usually do this. And why don't I do this? Because I don't like to see the Black experience treated as a treat for white people to get their rocks off, just oohing and eyeing and feeling that sympathy. That is not going to get us anywhere. I'm not doing it for that. I'm doing it because I'm contributing to this work of healing the racial divide. And I want to make clear how much of a racial divide we're talking about. So, Adam, next slide. Here's my dad. My father was born in 1920 in Cleveland, Ohio. His father was from, I think it's called Pak Chao, Toisan in China. His mother was a mulatto. That's a precursor to, now I think we'd say biracial, but a mulatto from the Black community in Cleveland. And what is interesting here, and why I bring this up, my father lived the first 10 years of his life as the eldest son in a relatively middle-class Chinese household of, my uncle described it as his family had a car in the 20s, his family had a car, they had a phone, so those indicators of relative wealth. But in 1930, my grandfather was deported back to China because of, a claim of smuggling opium through his business. What that meant was that their property was confiscated. Next slide. So now my grandfather, Adam, can you go to the next slide? My father then was taken in by, my grandmother's brother and living in the Black community. And specifically, I remember when I saw on the census map where they lived in the 1920s, they lived on the tracks of Kingsbury Run. So Kingsbury Run was essentially it was a whole shanty town. It built on a landfill and a trash landfill. The residents of the Kingsbury Run, they were poor people. We're also talking the Depression. So here it is, we're well into the years of the Depression. They're living on a landfill, what they described as a shotgun house. Now there are 4 children in the Wong family with my grandmother, and her brother, Patrick Kane, had 6 children. So there's 8 of them and 5 of my family, and they're living in 6-room shotgun house. So we've got lots of people sharing this house in a dump. Next. So in about 1936 or so, there was at the peak of the Great Depression, Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was, as everything in those days, all the military, all the conservation, everything was segregated. So my father was sent to a segregated, he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps because he could make money to send back to his mother to help support the family. So he went to Zanesville, Ohio, to start to plant trees with a large group of Black young men who went there. This is a picture of my father over here to the right. And they went to create trees or build trees or plant trees in Zanesville as part of this segregated unit. And it's interesting to note that these segregated Black units, this was far away from the town centers, because the white people did not like having, it's still the same today, really, it's still the same. When we talk about creating any low income, anything, white people in white communities say, not in my backyard. So it was the same thing. So they put them out into the forest. Next slide. So that's where he was in 1936. And at the time, we've got America's whole segregated armed forces. So he's part of a segregated Civilian Conservation Corps unit in 1936. And we've got the segregated armed forces. We've got people in our audience, Dr. Berry and Jill Berry, both are veterans. And they will, maybe during the end, we'll be able to talk with them, because they said that Dr. Berry said that many of the Black veterans never learned, and we'll talk soon about the GI Bill, but they never even learned about the possibility of benefits in the GI Bill. So Adam, can we take the next slide? So my father, after his Civilian Conservation Corps experience, went back home, immediately joined the Army. So he joined the Army in, I think it was 1941 or so, 1942, just when United States of America was entering into the World War II. They were a segregated Army. The Fort Huachuca is in Arizona, and it was all Black units in Fort Huachuca. And interesting to me has been that my grandfather, my mother's father, who was part of the Buffalo Soldier Group, also at Fort Huachuca in 1917. So they were both at Fort Huachuca. It was still a segregated unit. Next slide, please, Lane. Sorry, Adam. Now here, I have to say that because we're talking the GI Bill and we're talking about patriotism, and it's always, it's kind of a heartrending thing to me. And it's you know, I do it with a little begrudgingness to this country, that all of my people, all of the men in my family, before there were women allowed as active service, they all participated in the military, starting with World War I, my grandfather, and then World War II, my uncles, my father, and then everybody, our whole family, my cousins. We were all, we fought for this country from the beginning. Next slide. Now, we're talking now, Second World War, the GI Bill and redlining, GI Bill. Next slide. Here we have the GI Bill. And the idea behind the GI Bill was give these returning veterans a piece of the rock. Let them learn to really love America because they're going to own part of America. And that was some of the thinking behind the creation of the GI Bill. And so that's the thinking. They want them to learn to love America. You know, although my family, my Black family, they loved America. They fought for this country. In droves, we fought for this country. But there was a fear when they were creating this GI Bill that would create some kind of Black advancement. And they feared that returning veterans, because they already saw what happened in World War I, the returning veterans, they didn't want to return and be subservient and to the slavery adjacent roles that they were in. So to make sure that the GI Bill largely benefited white people, they ensured that the GI Bill helped as few Black veterans as possible. Next slide. Okay. Is there, okay, I don't know, I'm watching them. Okay, they're saying that they can't hear me. So I want to bring up and remember that all of the Wong brothers, here are the three male Wong brothers, my father, here they are, Si Hong. Interesting as an aside, when he was in the service, he legally changed his name. He didn't want to be Si Hong because he's in a Black unit. That didn't make sense for him. And so he changed his name to David S. Wong. My uncle, Sitoi, my other uncle, Sipun, they all joined and served the military. My father and the brother on the right were both in Black units. By the time Uncle Sitoi came along in Korea, they had pretty much disbanded the segregated army. So next slide, please. Now, the GI Bill, what did that mean? That meant education, but it also meant this piece of the rock, this home for people to have families. And so you've got this two different looks. Redlining meant that you draw a red line around any groups where there are Black people living, and you call those areas, redlined areas, you call them the hazardous places. And then here on the other side, the suburban life. That meant you have tree lawns, those are single homes, schools, all the amenities, the roads, everything that you needed to build a life and to start to feel like you are an American and what that means. So I want to point out that it wasn't just that redlining contained Black people. It was also that it contained any kind of investment in the red line community, which pretty much meant the Black community. So that meant that just like now I think about Starbucks, if you want to see where a community is starting to be on the movement up, you start to see where Starbucks is located. Well, Starbucks could not invest, could not get a mortgage to invest in a red line community. Industry could not invest in a red line community. There was disinvestment. The things that you need went into in full throttle, went into the white suburban community. They paved the roads. They put in sewers. They put in building all kind of industry so that people could have places to work. They built roads. They didn't do that. They contained. The idea with redlining, really, and we'll see that more, was to contain Black people, to hold them in so that, as Jordana pointed out, the virus of Blackness didn't spread over and infect the white people. Next slide. So here we are. This is Cleveland, where I'm from. And you can see the Lake Erie, and along the shores of Lake Erie, you see this red area. This is the red area, has always been where the Black people have lived. And the yellow areas, those are the areas that are close to where the Black people live. So those are declining, or you're taking a chance. I think you could only get about 15% mortgage if you wanted to buy something or invest in those yellow areas. And I've got Catherine here and Frank Sr. They're looking at this Cleveland map. They know it well. The blue areas are, they're pretty good. They're still desirable. And then the green areas is where you could do full investment, and the suburban areas could thrive. Now, this containment and holding down and keeping people in poverty intentionally has greatly scarred, both psychologically and in terms of economic growth, scarred Black Americans for generations, blocking access to wealth, to capital, blocking access to education, government financing. All the basic tenets for wealth building have been removed from, so the wind is pushing in the face of Black people and brown people and at the backs of white people. So the benefit of whiteness takes, pulls out of the Black community and into the white community. Next slide, please, Adam. So here we go back to remember what Jordana talked about, the housing, this HOLC, this Housing Act. And the importance of that is that the thinking in the HOLC created the redlining system. So they called it security. So that was what they were doing. They were making the real people who counted, the white people, making them secure. And so just as a reminder, this goes all the way back, as I like to point out, when we had the Dred Scott decision in 1857, and Supreme Court Justice Taney said, the Black man has no rights that the white man need respect. So that has never changed. And so this is how the wind is blowing here. So this is how they created the redlining system. The Federal Housing Act that was started to build the highways, and the highways made it possible for the white people to live out in the suburbs. They pretty much cut the highways through the Black community. We'll talk about that later. The whole eminent domain, and how they cut the highways right through the middle of the Black community, because they could just take You know, white people take what they want all over the world. And that's, of course, a generalization. That's how I see it. So change the slide, please. New slide. Adam. In addition to redlining, we also, so the redlining is, you know, the government, the FHA loan said that they did not allow FHA mortgages in redline communities. So remember, we look at this redlining as security. So as Jordana pointed out, we're not talking race. It sounds race neutral, you know, it's security. But the redlining, the effect of redlining and the intention of redlining was to contain the Black community in as tight as possible, with no outlets except to allow them to come out and work for the white people. In addition, we've got covenants. So people in their homes and in communities started to develop covenants. And these covenants that went into the deed basically said, if you hear, it says here, here's an example: none of the said lands, interests therein, or improvements thereon shall be sold, resold, conveyed, leased, rented to, or in any way used, occupied, or acquired by any person of Negro blood, or to any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, or Syrians. And as Lane pointed out, over time, and it's interesting, everybody should go and start doing some research on why and how categories and groups of white people, now we think of them as white people, like Jews and Italians and Irish, and here they're very specific: Armenians, Persians, I think that would be Iranians and Syrians. So those were included, and that meant that as I read, that meant that municipal officials could wash their hands of the racial impact, because they said that didn't have anything to do with us. It's in the deed. They can't help it. It's in the deed. So again, then, so you've got redlining, you've got racial covenants and deeds. And so if you have redlining and you can't get an FH loan, what does that mean? That means you could buy on land contract. Now, my father, we bought our house on land contract. We could not get a GI loan. And that's why I put up and went into such depth about how all my family and all those men fought for this country, but couldn't get a GI loan, couldn't get an FHA loan, and had to buy on land contract. And so what was land contract? First, we bought our home for $6,000 on land contract. Land contract is really like rent to own. And that meant that you really had a relationship with the seller, and you had a kind of a rental thing where every month you paid, and you kept paying until you finally paid it off. Many people, if you had something that came up, some kind of a catastrophe, and you couldn't make a payment, you could be kicked out immediately. And the other important thing, you never develop equity. You don't get any equity. So you know now that you take equity out of your house to send your kids to school. You take equity out of the value of a house so you can help your children put down payments on their homes. You do a lot of things with your equity, but you never had equity in land contract homes. We didn't have any equity when we bought the house in 1952. So Adam, please, next slide. No equity. So here I am. I'm growing up. In 1952, I'm in the first grade. Here it is. I live, this is the main street on the left. This is Kinsman Road. As it looked in the 1950s, that's how I remember it, walking. So I come up to the corner of Kinsman and walked down. So I'm at 71st Street. I walked down to 79th Street. My mother was concerned because I had to walk down a main street. And it may come as a shock to all of you parents now, but we walked to school on our own. I was in the first grade. I was not a baby. I was able to, I think my mother took me to school on the first day. After that, I'm on my own. We also didn't have cell phones. So in those days, you go out and they'll see you when you get back. And so I walked down the street, and here is my elementary school on the right, Kinsman Elementary School in 1952, where I was in the first grade. Next slide, please, Adam. Here is a home. This is the best picture I could find. Here on the left, you see the little front porch on our little dead-end street, Roy Avenue. That was our home. This is me on the porch. This is my dad and my younger brother. Here's our whole family here on the right. Here we are, looking very, I mean, we're a nice family. We're a nice family. So about 1955, living in our red-lined home off of Kinsman. So next slide, please. Now, what did that mean what did it mean to live in a red-line community? What did it mean in Cleveland to live in the home where I lived in? So keep in mind that there's a little street, Roy Avenue, and we were on that street. Now, it was a dead end, and overlooking the dead-endedness part of it, down was a ravine. Cleveland is the city of ravines. So there was a 50, 60, 70 at different spots, about 70-foot drop ravine right up above right below our house. And so when I look down, you look over here at the green picture. And when we first moved there, it was all green. And it felt really good to live in all of this nature and all this greenery. So we had this nature preserve. And so what I didn't know in 1952 and moving onward, that nature preserve, that was called Kingsbury Run. It was a stream that led from Shaker Heights, a high-end community in Cleveland, in Ohio. And it came down and kind of ended up close to where my house was. And it was an open sewage. So it was down at the bottom of this ravine was a big, long stream of open sewage running through, taking the waste and the effluents and all the products and the dumped stuff out of Shaker Heights. And where did it go? It went into the inner cities. It took them into the Black community. So remember, this area has been disinvested. And that's more than just not invested. That is taking out all wealth. How do you take out all possibility of wealth? You build an open sewage dump and you put it there, because who wants to live there? So this is what I saw as a kid. But now right below that, you see not far up, when Garden Valley, that I'm going to start to talk about, when Garden Valley was built, we started, this was a Standard Oil owned this property around it. This is John D. Rockefeller. And they used it as a dump to dump their waste. So the oil waste, and here is what it kind of looks like. And over to the right at the bottom is later on, as they started to fill it in, then they also filled it in and turned it into a closed sewage. So they bricked it in and made it closed sewage. It still was a sewer, but it was closed. And then it started to look, they took out all the trees, everything that made it look good. They took out all that and they left the sewer. So here, now the reason I have these big rat teeth, so we're living in our little house on Roy Avenue. We moved there in 1952. And then let's come to the next slide, Adam. So eminent domain. So here we've got different policies. We've got the GI Bill. We've got, but then that's offset by the racial covenants, and those are offset again by, here we have eminent domain. So eminent domain, what does that mean? That meant that we had a 300-foot property. It went down to the open sewage, but it still was our property. And so the state came through and they took half of it. So they took 150 feet off of all of our neighbors, and that was by eminent domain. So by eminent domain. And so what did that mean? That meant that the state started to build on behind us, block after block of low-income housing. It's now behind us, remember, is this dump. It's still this garbage dump and the open sewage. They started filling that in and they built low-income housing. So eminent domain. Next slide, please, Adam. So here, I don't know if you can get any sense of this, but up in the left-hand corner, up at the top, there's a little, looks like little houses, and it's something called Roy Avenue. That's where I lived. And then if you come down and you swipe down, you can see these big buildings, and that is what became Garden Valley. And here down at the bottom, all of that. So we were in a neighborhood of single houses, dilapidated, but single houses. And everything was raised, and Garden Valley was built to house Black people. And that's exactly, they called it something else. They said something else. And it became a slum within 1 year. And why did it become a slum? Well, first of all, it's built on a trash dump. You have all of these units, and there's nothing. There's nothing. There's no recreation. There's no place for the kids to go, to do, nowhere to go. You don't want to go down into the toxic waste dump to play. Next slide, please, Adam. And here now, behind my house, I'm in the yard behind my house. This is in 1966, my firstborn there with my ex-husband there holding his daughter. And I put this slide in to show that we're having family life. And you look behind us, here we are, Garden Valley. So all surrounding us, we are surrounded by low-income housing with nothing for anybody and not well maintained. So next slide. So for rent, when I started to look for housing for my family, myself, my husband, then we had one daughter. And I started looking in the papers, and this is in the 60s, this is 1966, 1965, and everything said whites only. I mean, it all said whites only. So how are Black people contained? They're contained by the no mortgages, they're contained by a land contract, contained by racial covenants and deeds, eminent domain that can take your property. And there's only two reasons that they took the property, really. One is to build low-income housing. Cleveland had some of the first big low-income projects in the nation. And the other thing that they did was to build things that benefited white people. So like the Highway Act, that meant that the highways could come through, and all these suburbs that they built now had a way to get from the downtown area to work. It was very convenient, but they took all that property from the Black community. So this is how wealth doesn't get to be accrued in the Black community. So, and I would be absolutely lying if I said I wasn't still traumatized today by just it's not just living in redlining, living in a toxic waste dump, going to substandard schools. But it's hearing on the news every day how your people are worthless and how they're not hardworking and how they live in the slum because they don't care. They like, that's called the Black living. That's called being Black. That's being real. Live in poverty because that's being real, and because your people don't have enough brain power and gumption to get up and do what Lane's people did, which is work hard and make a way. But the wind is at our face. I'm feeling it still today. I'll never get over it. It's the legacy of white supremacy that most Black people, you might not be able to tell by looking at Black people, but we feel it still today. So where did I move? We moved to Garden Valley because everything else said whites only. So here we are. This is what it started to look like all around. I mean, I was a stone's throw away from the house I grew up in. We moved to Garden Valley. And next slide, Adam. If that's the last, oh, here I am. Okay, now the end of this story is, here's my home, 7020 Roy Avenue. And remember, we bought it in 1952 as for $6,000. In 1977, when my father died, the house was valued at $2,500. There were no purchasers. So my sister, who inherited the house, she gave it to the people across the street. Why not? They gave it to the people. Eventually, it was abandoned. And here I am a couple of years ago, I went back, as we all do, we're called to go back and visit the places where we're from. And I sat on the porch and I reminisced about the days, and looking out over my left shoulder, I could see there's many stories I could tell about the Kingsbury Run, including how, I won't go into it, but here I am. And finally the house was demolished. And so there go all of our memories. And we never had any wealth. So I couldn't pass anything down to my children. And so they're on their own, just like all Black people. Country doesn't help you here at all, ever, never did. Only does things to detriment Black people. So thank you for listening. I think that's the last slide. Am I right? Oh, the acknowledgments and the sponsorship. We have some sponsors, and they have made this, all of our Racial Justice Collaborative work possible. And we invite you to also, in your groups, become sponsors so that you can help us do more work. We've got this whole line of cultural groups here in around me in Massachusetts, the Somerville Arts Council, the Mass Cultural Council, the Wayland Cultural Council, Wellesley, Natick, and the Newton Cultural Council. And our special thanks to our platinum sponsor, the Sierra Community, and we're bringing them in July to talk about some plans that they have. So thank you very much for listening to me. We're going to keep moving on so we can get you into your breakout groups. And I'm going to thank you again. I'm going to call on Lane. Lane, can you come and describe what the breakout groups are going to do and give them the questions?
Yeah. First of all, wow. You hear that story that you told, Diane, and just in itself, and then compared to my family's story, and that your house decreased in value, where mine increased, and then you ended up giving it away. Oh my God, so much of what you said. Thank you, Diane. So we're gonna move into we're kind of behind. So we're gonna move into small groups, and let's see. Can I put this into the chat? So here are the questions for the small groups in the chat. So first of all, how do you identify racially? We always ask in the Racial Justice Collaborative to start out with that question. And then, where did you grow up and what was the racial makeup of your neighborhood? right? And when you're answering that question, please think about the impact of your neighborhood's racial makeup on one or two of these areas, like your upbringing, your schools, your friends, your opportunities, and your family wealth. And then, so go around like that, and then go around again. Did the impact of your neighborhood's racial makeup also impact your sense that you deserve what you have? And if others don't have it, they don't deserve it or didn't work hard? Or did the impact of your neighborhood's racial makeup also impact your sense that if you didn't have, it was because you and your people are not worthy and didn't work hard enough? Or were there other impacts there? And then the last question is, where do you choose to live now and why? And is that neighborhood racially mixed or segregated? And are your closest friends the same race as you? We're talking about the people who visit your home, whose homes you visit. And that goes down to what Jordana was talking about how many white folks just are friends with white folks. So yeah, so we're gonna break into small groups, and we're gonna talk about those questions, and then we're gonna come back. We've got yeah. So and with your small group, just be aware of how you share the time, and also be aware of how many questions there are, and that it's going to be helpful to get to all of those questions in your small groups.
Lane, can I ask something? And Diane, it's noon, right? How much time now? Because we have an hour.
Yeah, well, we had originally allotted half an hour for the breakout groups. We can still give them half an hour.
Oh, good. And then a half hour to
Yeah.
discuss. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, because actually we have our breakout. Wow, we're right on time. Look at that. The breakout group was supposed to start at noon. Wow, that's amazing.
It is.
Wow.
Can I add one thing? I have to just say this because I showed you those rat teeth and how big they were. And I want to say why I did that. When they started filling in the open sewage, you cannot imagine the size of the sewer rats that started coming out. And now that was a real invasion, invading our homes. And so my father had to break up the glass and concrete in all around the foundation because they could bite in, and they came into the house and we'd see them in our house. They were huge. So that's all I wanted to point out. That was a trauma. So
and I just want to mention that that can be traumatizing just to listen to, and I saw some people not wanting to listen to that. So respecting that as well. Yeah. And yeah. All right. Whew. All right. So I think, Adam, are you going to break us into small